All right, let's turn to Esther we'll be at the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. There's certain sermons that I'm more nervous to preach because it just doesn't flow to me as well. This is one of those sermons, maybe I shouldn't say this. You can judge afterwards. But this is one where I've been more chomping at the bit to preach. I think that it will land with you in your heart. I pray the Spirit will help it land and cut to your heart today. This is where the story really picks up. We've been doing, that's why week 1, we titled the sermon Setting the Stage. You could have really called weeks 1 and weeks 2 Setting the Stage for the action to really start happening. And we're going to start to see the action really pick up and take place. So really quickly, let's do a brief review from how we got from chapter 1 really up into the end of chapter 2. So if you remember, Israel, the nation of Israel, was in captivity under the Persian Empire. You know, they've been warned about their sin time and time since Deuteronomy 28. They had been warned and warned and warned and warned as a nation. And it says, if you don't adhere to my commands, I will scatter you. That had taken place. God had scattered the nation of Israel, and now they were under captive in Persia, the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, 50 to 100 years prior to when Esther was written, King Cyrus at the time granted the release of the nation of Israel to go back to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and to really be a formal nation again. And what we said was there was a remnant of those Jews that chose not to make the return back. And the story of Esther is about those Jews that made the decision not to go back. And we talked about in week 1, there could have been a lot of confusion for those Israelites. It's like, are the promises of God still for us? Or is it for the nation of Israel over there? All right? And so that's the setting of Esther. Then we get into chapter 1. And King Ahasuerus throws a big party, right? He ends up drinking too much. He has an anger outburst, and he gets rid of his queen. Now, there's a lot of other things that happen within that, but that's the gist of it. And that really opened the door for him to find a new queen. So he has a contest, really, to find a new queen. We talked about that last week. And we know that Esther was the one who won favor and became queen, all while concealing her identity as a Jew. And so at this point, if you haven't read ahead in the book of Esther, it really doesn't seem that big of a deal. Like, well, what is the big deal? I mean, they're in captivity, they're in exile, but there's a reason that they stayed in captivity. Everything was easy for them there. I mean, they were living their own life, and they were fairly comfortable living in Persia. They were treated pretty well. So it's like, what's the big deal? Why is it a big deal that Esther becomes queen? I mean, they stayed. There's a reason they stayed in Persia. It's because it wasn't so bad. If it was terrible, they would have got out of there. But it was actually pretty fine. So today we're going to see that it would become a big deal that Esther rises to power ultimately. So we're going to be covering chapter 2, verse 19, all the way to 4:17, all right? That's 36 verses. It's what you got to do sometimes in the Old Testament here. So what we're going to do is we're going to have 3 points, and it's going to be 3 chunks of 12 verses, all right? So the title of the sermon today is The Clear and Confusing Providence of God. Now, we say confusing in quotes, because it's not confusing in the eyes of God. To us, it is often confusing. God is providential. God leads, He guides, He directs. We know that as believers. However, it's often very confusing in our lives, as you know. However, to God, it is very clear. It is perfect and it is right. No matter how weird or confusing or hard it may seem to you, to God, it is always right. And so your outline, as you see on your worship guide, We're going to see confusing rewards, confusing retribution, and a confusing rescue. How God rewards at times or doesn't reward oftentimes seems confusing to us. We'll see that revenge is imposed upon Israel really for no reason. It's like, why, Lord, would you allow that to happen? And then even the rescue of the Jewish people, there's some odd stuff in that and some confusion in that. All right? So that kind of gives us where we're headed. All right? But God will work through it all. All right, so let's start in chapter 2, where we ended, chapter 2, verse 19. All right, I'm going to read through 3:6, so 12 verses here. I think that's 12. All right, so now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther had obeyed Mordecai, just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Now, verse 22 is a key verse. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai. There is God's providence. He happened to be in the right place at the right time, quote unquote. And he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. And then the chapter just ends, all right? Let's go and let's just see a complete 180 in chapter 3. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. So this guy gets promoted. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, what did he do? He was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So, as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So you see the story starting to unfold. All right, so I'm going to address verses 19 through 23 really quickly. We see that Mordecai is at the gate. So what does that mean? So in ancient times, you had to travel by foot. You could not travel by flight. There was no airplanes. So a strong fortified city was walled, okay? And so at the entrance of these cities, there were, the walls, there were these areas where really business would take place. This is where really all the bigwigs would hang out and stand. And they would, legal matters, civil matters, commercial matters. This is where all the business really took place. It's where all the popular people were, the high and mighty people. Mordecai happens to be there, as we saw, and he overhears a plot to kill King Ahasuerus, okay? What happens? He reports it, as he should do. He reports it, and then what happens? It goes unrewarded. Yet we see in chapter 3, and we'll get into this, Haman gets promoted. Yet Mordecai didn't, and the king heard. We see that. So this leads us to point out something that I want to apply to your life really quickly. It leads us to point out something that, if we're being honest, we don't really like to say out loud. Why are we not, or at times, not rewarded when we live by faith? Have you ever said that? I know you have. Where it's like, I just took a step of faith, and we expect to get rewarded for that. We expect God's favor upon our lives when we've taken a step to do something. I remember one time, I was working full-time at a church in Greensboro, and a lot of you guys know the story, and I left the job and raised financial support like a missionary would, and internally and pridefully, I thought that would just be the easiest thing ever. I'm like, I'm taking this big step of faith, Lord. You're going to reward me. Now, He did. He provided for me in crazy ways. But if you only knew how many times I doubted the Lord in those moments. And you know why I doubted Him? And you know why I got angry with Him? Because deep down, I'm thinking, Lord, I took a big risk for you. I took a big step of faith. You should bless me for that. And I would shake my fist and I would get angry at Him. There's been times, another example, there's been times in my life, and maybe you've been here too. It's so hard to evangelize, right? Takes a lot of strength to just do it. And the one time you finally decide to evangelize, you think it's just going to be awesome and revival is going to break out. And what happens? Half the time is you forget what to say, they laugh at you, and you turn back to God and you don't evangelize anymore, right? And you're like, Lord, I actually took a step of faith and I forgot what I was supposed to say. I mean, there are countless examples that we could come up with. The so-called rewards often seem very confusing to us. So if God is so powerful, let's just ask the question, why won't He reward Mordecai here? If He has the ability, the authority to do it, why won't He reward him? Well, I think if we look at this from a humanistic standpoint, we would just say, well, because the foolish king forgot. I mean, we're going to see a theme with the king here, that he's a pretty foolish king, and we're going to continue to see more. We would say, well, I'm at the king's mercy. He didn't allow it. He forgot. But remember, in weeks 1 and even 2, we talked about how God is sovereign over kings. He could still make it happen if He wanted to. So that's why our question always comes back, and we often direct it back at God. God's methods are often confusing to us. What I want you to get today, at this point at least, is that is not uncommon. That's not uncommon throughout all of history, that God's ways seem confusing to man. I'll give you 2 examples here. I think of David. You don't have to turn here. I'm going to read it. You remember the story of David and Goliath, right? And they're all scared. Who's going to fight this Philistine? Who's going to fight this guy? Then David strongly stands up, and what does he say? Let's see, verse 26, chapter 17. And David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that thinks he should defy the armies of the living God?" And so the people answered him in the same way and said, "So shall it be done to the man who kills him." David's basically saying, who does he think he is? I'm going to stand up and I'm going to do it because I trust the Lord. He's taken a stand. He's acting in faith. He's taken a risk, whatever you want to call it. So you think the people are like, "Yay, David, pat him on the back." Well, the very next verse, verse 28. Now, Eliab, his eldest brother, this was his own brother, heard when they spoke to the men, or when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, "Why have you come down?" He said, "You're a shepherd boy. What do you think you're doing? Why are you coming here? You don't belong here." He says, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left with those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." And David said, "What have I done now? Was it not but a word?" So we think of you had to imagine David's heart. He's like, I'm going to step up and do this. Quiet confidence. I'm going to take a step of faith. And then his older brother comes at him and says, "Who do you think you are? What are you doing?" That would have to be discouraging to him. If I'm David, I'm confused. I'm like, "Lord, I've taken a step of faith for you. I need my own family to support me." And it didn't happen. They mocked him instead. The other passage I think is a better example, and I alluded to this week 1. I think the story of Joseph has this written all over it. So in Genesis 4, we know the story of Joseph. He was thrown in prison for doing right, for fleeing Potiphar's wife. So he was thrown in prison for that. And while Joseph's in prison, he's faithful in prison. He's sharing the Lord with his inmates. Then he rightfully interprets the chief cupbearer's dream. And the chief, he's going to tell the Pharaoh. Joseph had to think, this is my chance. This has got to be God sovereignly orchestrating things and opening a door for me to get out of this prison, right? This makes sense. Well, what happens? Verse 14, only remember me when it is well with you. And please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. And did he do it? No, he forgot. It doesn't make sense. It's confusing in the moment. Again, I want us to understand we're going back through time here, the beginning of time. Confusion is not uncommon. It's very common, actually. It's how God works. So, let me challenge you. We shouldn't be discouraged and doubt when things don't go the way we think they should go. Very simply. Now, we'll come back around to this. You say, well, what's the solution to that? We'll come back around to it. But if you continue to read the story of David and Joseph, we see eventually that they were favored. But only in God's time. His timing is always perfect. And that's where we check out. We're okay with the exhortation and inspiration, then it's like, oh, it's the God's timing thing, huh? Just wait. Yes, it is. Timing is key to His providence. All right? So then, obviously, we see what's happening in verses 1 through 6 in chapter 3. Mordecai is overlooked. We saw that. We see Haman is promoted, who is an evil man. We see that. He's promoted to being second in command. And then we see that Mordecai doesn't bow down or pay homage or respect to Haman. Now, understand that this is not a religious act. He's not saying, bow down to me and worship me, that we know of. This was likely protocol. It was similar to like a curtsy or a bow to a British queen. Okay? And so we ask the question, well, why didn't he bow? It's a little interesting because they did some questionable things we saw last chapter. It's like they concealed the identity, and now you want to take the stand and not just bow and pay homage to the guy and pay respect. You could question that and debate that. The text really doesn't say why he did it. What was likely is that Mordecai came from the lineage of King Saul. Remember King Saul? And Haman, as we see here, came from the lineage of Agag. And there was a negative family history here. I'll put it that way. And so bowing to Haman likely for Mordecai was just too much. I can't do this. There's too much family history, and there was likely some hatred there. And so he just said, I'm not going to do it. So Mordecai takes this stand, right or wrong, and it leads to what? Genocide. It leads to potential genocide of the whole nation. It's crazy. Whereas Haman's wickedness leads to favor. Try to add that up. Try to logic your way through that one. You can't. It doesn't make sense in our eyes. It doesn't at all. It's easy for us to read these stories, but remember, this is real life for them. They were really dealing with this stuff. So put yourself in Mordecai's shoes, and we'll see his shoes in chapter 4, verse 1 through 3. Nothing is adding up. Nothing is making sense. This is, again, I said it last week, this is not some inspirational speech. This is God's word. Is this how you often feel in life? I'm trying to obey. I'm trying to follow the word. And nothing makes sense. It just doesn't add up. I don't get it. Why? And we get really frustrated, and we end up checking out. We end up living in sin. Maybe that's you. Maybe it's, maybe you're like Mordecai. Maybe he felt foolish. Maybe he was thinking, all I had to do was just bow. That's all I had to do, and my nation would be saved. They wouldn't be wiped out on the face of the map. That's all I had to do. Maybe you thought that. Maybe you thought, if I just made this decision, none of this would have happened. But again, we see the same theme again and again and again through Esther. That God has favor on His covenant people, despite the actions, despite the decisions that they make. So, to make things worse, things will get worse, as we'll see here. So that's confusing rewards. Doesn't make sense. Now it gets worse. There's retribution that becomes confusing. So let's read verse 7 through chapter 4, verse 3. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots, before Haman day after day. And they cast it month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So Haman's coming up with a plan to execute the Jews here. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. This is the Jews. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. So get rid of them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries. So the king took his signet ring from his hand, and he gave it to Haman, the Agagite, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. Foolishness, guys, just foolishness. Didn't decide to investigate the matter. Verse 12, then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month as an edict, according to all that Haman commanded. Was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces, to the officials of all the people, to every province in its own script, and every people in its own language. So it's an edict that's going out to make this thing official. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instructions to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Like, what's going on here? Now, here's Mordecai's reaction. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, which was a customary way of mourning. And he went out to the midst of the city, and he cried with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate, clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. So here we see the story is starting to really get hot and heavy, honestly. So Haman's come up with a plan here. We see the plan in these passages. So one, they cast lots to determine the genocide date, the execution date. Then what he does is he lies about the Jews. He says they don't keep the king's laws. Then he bribes the king to decree it. Then the king foolishly allows it. A lot of foolish things, a lot of sinful things happening here. So let's really quickly, just context here. Lots literally means throwing a dice, okay? It's literally what that means. It's really it was a way of asking gods to answer them. Now, at times, believers were commanded to do this. This was a practice that was often used before the coming of the Spirit. So we have the Holy Spirit within us. We have His completed Word. And so we know we can seek wisdom, and He can give us that wisdom. So that's all that lots were. The lot happened to fall in the 12th month. All that means is they'd have to wait 11 months to carry out the execution. Okay? So the execution date was final, and they had 11 months to carry it out. Okay? So what's going to happen within these 11 months to change things or to turn things? Okay? Now, really quickly, let me encourage you here. Proverbs 16:33 says, the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. We can roll dice all we want. The king and Haman could roll dice all they want, but every decision is in the hand of the Lord. Guys, there's no such thing as chance. There's no such thing as random events in your life. It does not exist. God governs it all. Every single detail of your life, He controls it. That has to be encouraging to us. And I think if we believe that in every circumstance, we would avoid despair and discouragement often. If we understand that God was sovereign over it. So we have the execution date. Now imagine being a Jew here. Man, what if we would have went back to rebuild the walls? That would have been great. God obviously doesn't care about us anymore. We thought we were His covenant people. Then they're accused of not keeping the king's laws. There's no evidence of that at all. In fact, it was in verse 15 we saw the nation was shocked about it. They were like, why? Because they were good citizens. So clearly they were lied about here. And then lastly, we see that Haman bribed the king in verse 10 and 11. 100,000 talents of silver is roughly 150 million. Gave him 150 million here. And the king gives Haman this signet ring, which was really a ring that designated authority. He's basically saying, you carry out whatever decision you want. Okay? Now, what we do see is a trend developing here. King Ahasuerus is a very foolish king, but he's also very lazy. He's just very lazy. We said it kind of last week. He just kind of goes off of his gut and his instinct and whatever feels good to him. He did what it was easiest for him. He did what it was most beneficial to him. He was greedy. And he seemed really easy to be taken advantage of. Now let me turn this, though, on its head really quickly to you. It's easy for us to look at the king and condemn him. It's easy to cast judgment on the king. But question yourself on this. This is a great quote. Ian DeGuide, he said in his commentary on Esther, he says, in a democratic political system, which is what we're in, we the people are the ones who possess the signet ring. How often do we take seriously our responsibility to examine carefully the arguments presented to us by both political parties? He says we're often too lazy to engage in serious thought. Then he says we can hardly be surprised or shocked if our government passes laws that are repressive toward religion or genocidal toward the unborn. Look, it's very easy for us to look at Ahasuerus and say, how dare you? We possess the signet ring. How lazy can we be with what's going on in our nation? All I'm saying is we're very foolish at times and we can be taken advantage of often. When we got stuff going on left and right around us and we think nothing of it. We don't care because it's easy to be an American. Life's going to go on. We're going to be rich. We're going to have our money. We're going to have our jobs. We're going to have our food. Everything's easy. When we, the people, have the authority. So all I'm saying is just be careful with casting judgment. I would say look within our own hearts there. Back to the story. Once again, the plan of God appears to be confusing by our own logic and our own timing. What do I mean? Well, Haman gets rewarded. He doesn't deserve to be rewarded. He's a bully. Israel is now on death row when they were just living as good citizens. That being said, though, now we start to see the providence interlocking. We start to see it coming together. We see the party, the drunkenness, the rage, the perversion, and the concealed identity all now are part of the plan of God to deliver His people. All the junk that's going on, He's going to use it to deliver His people. Because the Jews are about to be executed. But do you remember that the queen is a Jew? And it all worked out. The queen is not a Jew if Ahasuerus never throws a party. She's not a Jew if he doesn't get drunk. The queen is not a Jew if none of those things happen. God takes sinful things and uses them for His glory. That's why we say, come and behold Him when we sing Only a Holy God. Because these things are beyond our minds. That's why we behold Him. That's why we read His Word, because He's amazing. Now, lastly, the confusing rescue. Let's read 4:4 to 4:17, and we'll end. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. So she heard about it. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Haddock, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Haddock went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg for his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. So please plead for me on the behalf of my people. And Haddock went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. So here's Esther's response. This is key. Then Esther spoke to Haddock and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law: to be put to death, except the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter, so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. She hadn't even seen the king in 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that the king's palace you will escape any more than any other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And this is like the verse in Esther that most people, that's like the climax pinnacle verse in Esther. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. So from a human perspective, the Jews' only hope is Esther. God had providentially worked through ordinary and confusing circumstances to get Esther to this point. And while the answer here seems obvious, Esther's the answer, it's actually not that clear. Because in verses 5 through 8, we see Esther simply gathering information. What's going on? How did this happen? And she receives this command from Mordecai to confront the king. Mordecai saying, Esther, you're our only hope. You're a Jew and you're the queen. You have access to the king. Go do it. Okay? However, this is where the confusing part comes in. What's Esther's response? If I do, I'll be killed. I can't do that. No one could enter the king's presence unannounced. The penalty was death. Again, put yourself in Esther's shoes. Would this not be confusing to you? Again, on one hand, God opens a door. He allows Esther to rise to fame and to power. And Esther had to think, and the Jews had to think, this is our opportunity. However, there's confusion in that open door. And that's where it gets really confusing for us. God opens a door for you. God says, do this, you do it, and then it's confusion in the midst of it. And it frustrates us. I want us to continue to understand that is the purpose. Esther had to be confused. She had to be scared. It's easy to read Esther in heroic-like fashion. She's some great hero. And I believe she was to some degree. However, if you were Esther, I'd be doubting and worrying and fearing all over the place. I'm going to get killed. So either God raised her up to deliver her people or to be killed. That's got to be the final decision for her. That's got to be what she's thinking. It's either I'm here to deliver my people or I'm here to die. That is got to be a hard decision to wrestle with. Has to be a hard decision to wrestle with. So I'll ask you, has God opened a door for you with confusion attached to it? This is clear. I know this is what I was supposed to do. But this doesn't make sense, Lord. But that doesn't make sense. I don't get it. I said I'd come back around to this, and this is what I want us to get here. I think God, well, I don't think. God purposely does that. And I think the main reason He does it, He really wants to teach us patience. I mean, I think He desires so badly to teach us patience. Why? 1 Corinthians 13, love is what? Patient. I cannot love anybody. I cannot be Christ-like if I am not patient. And I wasn't patient this week at all. And this is what you're seeing right here. And some of you in here even know it. I mean, maybe all of you. I've talked to a lot of you. It's like God's opened these doors, and it doesn't make sense. Why? And I've been impatient day after day after day. And here's the crazy thing. Because I was impatient, I was likely a poor husband this week and a poor pastor and a poor friend. Because when I'm not patient, it's all about Ryan. It's all about me. But when I am patient, I can truly love other people and not care so much about my own wants. It's hard. I know. I think if there's anything that Megan said to me more in my life, it's Ryan, you're impatient. It's a struggle. I understand that. But I think that's what He wants. He wants to teach you patience through all this. He allows confusion in your life to teach you patience. Because when you're patient, you will love. And you will be like Christ, and you will reflect Him. Mordecai's response, Esther, you must be bold. You're going to die anyways. And it says, and who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. While God here is not acknowledged, I think what's implied is obvious. There's a meaningful course of history. The whole everything happens for a reason. That is actually true biblically. There is a meaningful course of history. God brought Esther to this point despite all that had happened previously. Right, wrong, or indifferent. There was right decisions in the process, there were wrong decisions in the process, and there were some where it's like they can go both ways and we can debate them. Despite all that happened, God brought Esther to this point. Despite all that's happened in your life. I don't care what's happened in your life. I do. But God has brought you to this point. Right, wrong, or indifferent. God has brought our church to this point. Right decisions, wrong decisions, indifferent decisions. He's brought us to this point at this church at 5 o'clock on Sundays for a reason. He's brought us to this point. What do we do with that? And hear me say this. No one's complained. Everybody's been wonderful. Everybody's been loving. Everyone's been supportive. I'm not implying anything here. But if you're anything like me, I'm a complainer and I'm impatient and I struggle with these things. And I know you can too. We must understand that God is sovereign and He's in control of every situation. And I don't know that anybody in here would deny this or argue this truth. But let me ask you, do your actions show it? We'll give lip service to it. Praise God, He's wonderful. What's going on behind the scenes? What's going on behind closed doors? I can come here to you guys and preach patience, and behind closed doors really struggle with patience. Now, the title hopefully makes sense of the sermon. The confusing plan of God becomes the clear plan of God when we're patient and when we trust in Him. It will start to become more clear. It became clear with Joseph. It became clear with David. It became clear to the disciples, and on and on and on and on throughout church history. Now, as we consider, this is what I want you to think of when we have communion here in just a second. Verse 16, Esther agreed to risk her life before the king. She says, if I perish, I perish. I don't know that it appears that she was super confident. I don't know that I would be confident. Consider this. Israel was on death row and needed a mediator. They needed someone to step in and advocate for them. And Esther was the one who would do this. Now, here's the thing. Esther was not the perfect advocate. Clearly, she was not the perfect advocate. This is similar to us. The wages of sin is death. We were on death row. We needed a mediator. If you're here and you're not saved, you're on death row. You're just like the Jews here, headed for death. And you desperately need a mediator. You desperately need someone to advocate for you. Our punishment was hell, separation eternally from God. But the free gift of God was Jesus, who lived perfectly and took our punishment. Consider this. God used a sinful advocate in Esther to save sinful people physically. God used a perfect advocate in Jesus to save sinful people eternally. John 14:6. He is the way, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through Him.